Thank you, everyone. My name is Chao Tayiana Bio. I sometimes go by the name Headstrong Historian, which I will explain later. But today I will be talking about working within African heritage, particularly digital heritage, some inspiration, my transformation, reflections, challenges, and what I see as futures. So in the very quintessential African way of storytelling, I want you to imagine a fireplace. While this might read as a guest lecture, I think to me it's more like saying a story, and I'd like to invite you into that frame of mind to picture this as a storytelling session, because that's what it is. And it's a story about how, it's a story about why, it's a story about where, and it's a story about when. I consider myself a historian by birth and a computer scientist by profession, or at least I have branded myself as such. And this is basically a fusion of my two loves. As I write here, of all the things that could capture the mind of a young African woman, mine came in two distinct forms: history and computer science. And for many people, this might seem that these disciplines have little to no interaction, but for me, they mean more together than they do apart. And let me explain. As a young girl, I was very intrigued by historical subjects, whether it's in documentaries, whether it's in school, whether it's in newspapers. I just always remember being very drawn to history and anything that was dealing with history in particular. And this first led me to learn not only about my history, but it also expanded my horizons. And it inspired in me a very strong desire at a very young age to look at history as an active thing. I also grew up with my grandparents and my mom, and this environment really just catalyzed this curiosity within me. At some point, when I was 18, I read this story by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie called Headstrong Historian. It's a short story looking at the ways in which colonialism affected our identity and our understanding of African cultures. And I'm going to read a very short snippet from the story, and this is my inspiration for my name and the work I do today. In Grace's school bag is a book about the pacification of Nigerian tribes. She goes on to read about the savages with interest and doesn't realize she's a descendant of the savages until a teacher tells her that her grandmother's poetry isn't actually poetry. In college in 1950, Grace changes her degree to history after hearing about a Nigerian man who resigned from an educational council after the council began talking about adding African history to the curriculum. And the story of Grace, it basically follows three generations, and Grace is the third generation. And it's basically her realizing that what she's been taught and what she's been fed about her identity, her Africanness, her grandparents, and her background has all been the white man's history. And so she sets out to change this. And the impact that this had on me when I read it at that age was, it really stirred my discomfort, because I had been feeling, I felt like within me, I had been feeling a certain discomfort that I knew I wanted to work in history, but I don't know how, I don't know where. And also in the way that African governments typically underfund, undervalue, and discredit the arts and humanities. History was not just an option that you could wake up and say, I want to be a historian, especially if you want to be successful. People would say, there's no money in that, or who's going to employ you? Study the sciences. And that's the kind of situation I found myself in. But apart from just stirring my discomfort, I had said, it awakened my curiosity. And I started feeling like there is something I could do. What can I learn? It justified my existence, because I often felt that as a young woman, when I watched documentaries, it was maybe older white men presenting, and I just couldn't see myself as a typical historical figure. But primarily what it did for me most, and I like to say that it catalyzed my stubbornness, very poetic, because I knew that there was something within me that wanted to go for this, in spite of everything and in spite of the circumstances. So how it began, I found myself studying computer science in 2012. And through this process, I began a blog. I had a little tech knowledge and I started a WordPress blog. It was called Agora. Now, Agora is a Greek word for meeting place. And I called this blog Agora because I envisioned it as a space where people could meet and people could talk. And this was a blog committed to the preservation of Kenya's rich history and culture. And I would cover various aspects of history. I would do photographs, I would do essays, I would do text. but it was basically things that greatly interested me as an individual. And at this time, I was mostly working with photographs. I would go to the Kenya National Archives, read up on a subject, find some records, take a few photos, create a narrative, and share it on my blog. And I think that was my first, pretty much my first foray into what I'd say is digitization. That was what I was doing. I had a phone, and I would go to the archives and the libraries in Nairobi, and that's what I would do. And I wrote this blog for around 2 years. And this was the beginning of my work in digital heritage, this blog. Now I'm going to repeat that because a lot of times when we talk about digital heritage, we often think that it has to be very complex, very technical, very high level, but this is how I started. And the reception to the blog was amazing. One of the stories that I did was an essay on the railway in Kenya, a historical essay. And one of the things that really, really struck me was how much people were willing to respond and to share the information, to share the content, to share the memories. People would send me photographs, say, this is my father on the train. This is such an excellent photo article. Thank you for doing this. And the reception for me was a catalyst. It really, really spurred within me the need to keep doing this thing and to keep writing and to keep documenting this work. And as I said, my only research was on the internet, or I would go to the archives, take a few photographs, create a narrative, combine it with stories from here and there. But what I didn't anticipate was the impact that it would have, creating a blog, a platform where people could talk about their history. And this led to a transformation within me. After writing this blog for 2 years, you'll recall that I said I was mostly working with sources that were already there. So archives or things on the internet. I transformed. I grew from this space of writing a blog, and I started a project called Save the Railway. Now, Save the Railway was a transition for me because I transitioned from working with historical sources to actually creating and documenting historical sources in the sense that I was now producing data. And the project was aimed at documenting and helping to preserve Kenya's antique railway stations in the wake of their dilapidated state. So first, I'll give you a bit of historical context for this. The railway in Kenya, which was known as the Uganda Railway, very interestingly, it was named after where it was heading, not where it was starting from. The railway ran from Port of Mombasa in Kenya to the Port of Kisumu, which borders on Lake Victoria, with access to Uganda. And this was built in 1896. Construction was started in 1896. It was 660 miles, 32,000 workers brought to Kenya from India to work on the railway, and the construction ends in 1901 at the port of Kisumu. But what's interesting about this railway is that it basically formed the backbone for urbanization in Kenya. Now, if you look at this map on the left, each of these points is a railway station. And if you look at the map of Kenya today, each of these towns, each of these stations became into a town, grew into a town or an urban center. So the railway is very seminal. It's very pivotal in Kenya's growth as a nation, as cities and as towns. But what happened in 2013, the government announced that there was going to be a new railway, which was being built by the Chinese. The old railway had declined. The buildings were abandoned, most of them. They were in disrepair. And I thought to myself, there's not much happening around how we're documenting the railway. How are we going to remember the railway? Whose memories, whose narratives are going to be remembered? The railway is very famous. If you look at the Kenya Railway, most people will think of the man-eating lions of Tsavo, which was a team, I would say a pair of lions which were eating railway workers at the time. But while this is a good and horrific story, it isn't the full story of the railway. After independence, the railway served Africans and Kenyans. It was run for a very long time. Most people went to school with it, transporting agricultural produce. So for me, the question when I started this project in 2013 is, where were these stories? Where were these narratives? And who was talking about them? So the project essentially was to document the railway in Kenya. It had 4 stages: to create a visual archive, which was to photograph the stations and map their locations, to capture the intangible history, interview people, what was your perspective on the railway, to crowdsource memory, starting conversations and dialogues on social media, having intergenerational understanding. What did my grandfather think of the railway? How did he use it as a child? And how did I use it as a child? And I also wanted to have a space to host and curate an exhibition, whether it was physical or digital. I was inspired by this one railway station. I lived in a little town called Voi, and when I went to the station, it was in disrepair, it was falling apart, and it was basically in decline. And when I got back to my hostel, I thought, let me research on the railway and see what's the state of other stations in the country. And it was a similar case where most of the stations in the country were falling apart. And I was looking at these buildings, not just as buildings themselves, but what did they represent? How many lives did they touch? What is the perspective that people have on these railways? So step one, my favorite step, was to create a visual archive. And this involved moving around the country, taking photographs of the stations themselves. Now you can see these are around, I think 10, but in total, I took photographs of, I think, over 50 stations. And it was all across Kenya, which was an incredible journey to undertake. I was a student at the time studying computer science, for context, because this will come out later. The second part of the project was documenting intangible histories. And when I talk about intangible histories, I'm talking about the oral traditions, the memories, the things that you won't find in books, you won't find them in archives. And this involves speaking to people. When I go to the different towns, I'd speak to them and say, what do you remember about the railway? The gentleman here, he recently passed away, but he had worked with the railways for 30 years. And when I asked him, why did you choose to work with the railway? He said, it was the organization that took me to school and back. So it was those things that you won't find in archives necessarily or academic literature that I really wanted to capture. The third part of the project was crowdsourcing memories, and I would either ask people to send me their memories on social media, or when I meet people, speak to them and note them down. I created this thing called a memory wall that you can see here, which is a compilation of the memories that people sent me. And I think that when you look beyond archives and books, then you begin to understand historical events, but you don't just understand them, you feel them, you see them, you hear them. So even if this wasn't a part of your history or a part of your life, when you hear it firsthand from someone, it has a completely different bearing from when you read it on your own. So some of the comments that people sent was, one of my enduring childhood memories is traveling on the train from Nairobi to Mombasa. This is a very worthwhile project. I wish you success. So these were the kind of memories that people were sharing about their lives, about their parents, about their grandparents. And the fourth part of the work was disseminating and preserving this work. Where does it go? Who does it belong to? And this is still a thing I'm working on, but a lot of the information is online. And if anyone wants access to these photographs, I share them if they're for non-commercial purposes. But I also try to deposit a copy, the photographs, the physical photographs. I printed them and took them to the Kenya National Archives. But it's basically a continuing conversation, and this was a great lesson for me on how we disseminate and present historical work, especially when it's done by private individuals. So again, for context, I was a student, I was studying computer science. It had nothing to do with my studies. So where does someone like me take this work? I'm not a museum, I'm not an archive. So some of the challenges that I faced were, first and foremost, a lack of financial and infrastructural support. It's very difficult to find funding as an individual because most people want to fund organizations. There's also a kind of delegitimizing of African participation in historical documentation, and I'll explain this. When I would show up at a place and say I'm taking photographs, particularly of this railway station, people would ask why, and I would say because this is for history and I'm trying to document and preserve this information. And people would ask why, but because that wasn't reason enough for a young woman to be out with a camera. And I often had to find myself really, really justifying this cause to the point where I had to just say it's a school project, Another challenge was gender and safety. It was very hard for me to travel alone. Because also when people see you alone, particularly you risk harassment, you get bullied. So I tried to have like a male friend or a colleague or family member with me. The fourth challenge, as I said, was that no systems to deposit or work with public institutions. which I think is a big gap in how we're trying to document African history. If there's no collaboration between the public and the private sector, it becomes very difficult for information such as these to end up in public collections, despite the fact that it is a public collection. One of the lessons from this was it's a continuing process. There is no end. In as much as I would have liked to say that I have finished this project, I don't think it will ever end, because there'll always be a new perspective, there'll always be a new turn. Digital media has a potential to change how we interact and engage with history. Very much so. Measuring the impact based on what people would send me, that's primarily how I measure the impact. And this is the direction to take: participation in history, and being stubborn enough to say, I will do it myself. So in 2016, I finished my degree in computer science. And in a chance encounter, I decided, let me see, after doing the Save the Railway project, I thought to myself, this is actually quite interesting. I wonder if I can do this as a career. And I went online in a very, I feel naive, but it was very interesting, because I literally just Googled masters plus history plus computer science. And the first course that came up was a course at the University of Glasgow called Masters in International Heritage Visualization. Now, what you're seeing here is a few words from my personal statement. You have to write a personal statement before you can be accepted into the program. And I looked at it today morning and I thought this would be a good addition to add. I'll read a small section of it, and in which I write, 4 years ago, I continue to be fascinated by the numerous ways in which technology is being used to promote and preserve heritage and culture around the world. Through this master's program, I look forward to building immersive and interactive platforms for more people to view history, study it, and ultimately learn from it. From the Kabaka tombs of Uganda to the mosque in Timbuktu, I particularly aspire to document, visualize, and preserve Africa's rich heritage for the sake of both present and future generations. And I believe that this course will allow me to do that and much more. Luckily and fortunately, I was admitted into the program, and I did the master's for 1 year, and this really allowed me to refine my scope, because I knew that digital heritage is the one thing I want to focus on. And the next step, after finishing my master's, I embarked on yet another big project, as one does. And I met up in the UK. I met up with a friend of mine called Olivia, and we started talking about colonialism. And what we realized was the fact that despite the fact that she's British and I'm Kenyan, we knew very little about the colonial period. If you rely on books or if you rely on movies, then you will get a very small percentage of what happened during colonialism. And this was a very interesting point for us. It was a very interesting intersection for me, because we realized that one, the fact that colonialism was not being talked about. Secondly, the history that was being portrayed was one-sided. Third, we were working across 2 continents. We didn't have access to records or infrastructure. So we thought, why don't we start a digital museum? And what is a digital museum? Honestly, I would tell you it's a website. It starts with a website and a WhatsApp group. That's literally all we had. And we wanted to challenge this idea that museums have to be physical, that museums have to have objects, that you have to go and peer behind a glass window, and there's an intermediary between you and the history. What would a digital museum look like? It has digital data. That was our first step. So I'll give you a bit of historical context on the colonial period that I'm talking about. Kenya is a former British colony. And in October 1952, the colonial administration in Kenya declared a state of emergency in the name of retaining control. What was happening is that there was a movement called the Mau Mau that was agitating and pushing for the liberation of Kenyan people, but also the return of large parcels of land which had been taken by British settlers, and local people and natives had been dispossessed. So the British government decides that to quash this movement, they're going to declare a state of emergency. And within the state of emergency, they set up a large-scale network of more than 100 camps, villages, in which people were detained. The Kenya Human Rights Commission estimates that 70,000 people were detained at the peak of the emergency, which ended in 1962, and at least 160,000 people passed through the network during the time in which the state of emergency was called. So what happens after independence is a very interesting thing. The first thing is that the British government, migrates and destroys archives. So a lot of the archives that proved that there were camps and detailed what had happened in these camps are either shipped off to the UK or destroyed. The second thing is that the structures of the detention, the buildings, the camps, the structures that were used to detain people are either destroyed or repurposed into schools and prisons here in Kenya. And the third thing is that Mau Mau as a movement is criminalized in Kenya until 2003. So what do a combination of all these factors do? They create an environment in one, this history is not talked about. It's not even known because you've erased the structures, you've erased the historical sources, and you prevented people from talking because Mau Mau is still a terrorist organization, which means that the passing of oral history was very stunted because you could actually be jailed or claimed to be participating in terrorist activities for talking about the Mau Mau. So what happens is that me, a third generation Kenyan, will not know about this history that my grandmother went through. And we're talking about something that is in living memory. Our response to this was to say, we don't have resources, we don't have money, we don't have space. What are we going to do? We'll use the skills that are available to us, digital media. The first step was to take, on the right, you will see a list of centers. These are all camps that were in Kenya in different parts of the country. And on the left, you will see a map. What I started by doing is translating the data that you see here into the data that you see here. And that blew my mind personally, but what I didn't anticipate was that how much it would shock people. Because when you see this on a map, when you see this laid out in front of you, then you understand the scale. For Kenyans, especially younger generation Kenyans, it's shocking. It's shocking to think that all these camps are here and we know nothing about them. So the visualization really was a first step. The second step was to do field work, pretty much in the same way that I had done with the railway project, to go to this site and see what is left, what is there, what can we find, who can we speak to. This is us at a school that was a former detention camp. And these are buildings that were actually used as cells to detain people during the fight for independence. And after independence, they were turned into classrooms. So we went to visit them to see, is there any existing evidence? And we could, in some of the buildings, you could still see barbed wire running along the roof to indicate that indeed this is a structure of detention, but also people were detained here. So when I look at this project, I look at it in terms of sources. And the thing that drew me most to this work was thinking, how do I combine these sources? How do I move from an oral history to archives to the physical evidence to academic literature and books? How do I combine this work? And so we thought, why don't we start creating digital visualizations, 3D visualizations of how these camps looked, because there are no photographs, there are no archives accessible here in Kenya. How do we make this information as relevant, as striking, and as impactful as possible? So we started doing 3D visualizations, and some of the types of visualizations that we've been doing. The first one, as you can see on the left, my left rather, is an archival image of a camp, and detainees can be seen leaving the camp. This building is not here today. This entrance is not here today. What we did is we created a digital visualization, a 3D visualization of this structure, and this is the one that you can see on your right. This is another visualization that's based on an archival resource. You can see here camp, an archival image. This was a camp, I think, in the early 1950s at the beginning of emergency. No longer there. These buildings have been brought down. We created a similar 3D visualization for this. And we've also done visualizations based on present day evidence. This is a building which was used as a torture chamber in one of the camps, and we've created a digital version of it. So you might be asking, if it's still there, why are you creating a digital version? I think when we look at the dichotomy between digital and physical, we need to understand how they play into each other. So in the first instance, this building that you see, despite the fact that it is still there today, it's not a public land. So you can't just enter and say, I want to see the Mau Mau structure or the detention camp structure. You can't. So which means it's publicly inaccessible, which makes it very difficult for people to visit it and see it as it's now a private school. So the digital data, the 3D data allows us to interact with these structures in a very high level, interactive level, because the physicality of these structures is either, they're either absent or they're inaccessible. The last one is a visualization based on oral history. This is the photo of how the building looks today. And we were informed by the community and a local guide who said that this building actually didn't have windows. It was used as a mass cell, so there were no windows. It just had one door and that was it. So when it became a school after independence, they put the windows. So when we were trying to reconstruct how it might have looked during the colonial period, we didn't put windows on the building structures because this was based on oral history information. So this project is still continuing. I like to think of it as a continuation even of the railway project. And some of the questions that we've had working within this digital space, how do we make technical aspects such as 3D and, this is technical jargon. How do we make it participatory? How do we make it community friendly? We're working with a lot of old veterans. How do we communicate this? The second one is how do we combine tangible and intangible histories through digital media? As I said, while I can take a photo of a building, unless I know someone's experience and what happened in that building, it would be very hard for me to relate to the context, the historical context. And we're saying that we believe that digital reconstructions are an incomplete picture if they're not contextualized by oral history and memories that they're linked to. And the third one is, how do we incorporate the memories, the experiences, and the emotions attached to these histories into digital media? Sometimes digital media can feel like a very lifeless space. It's a black screen, especially if you're looking at 3D data, you're just spinning something around in a black void, So how do we make this an emotive experience? How do we communicate the nature of this history, the pain, the discomfort, the things that people went through? So these are some of the questions we have. We are starting to have some answers. In some cases, we don't have answers. But I just wanted to share this because sometimes you can feel like you need to have a perfect project. And I feel like sometimes you need to start and then work out the questions as you go. And this is one of the cases. I'm trying to change. So look, we're producing a lot of data in this project. We're producing 3D models, we're producing photographs, videos, audio recordings, maps, notes. So there's a lot of data being produced. One of the challenges that we've had is how to archive it, but we're making it publicly accessible. If anyone wants to use this in their research, all the material is online, and we're still working out what to do. One of the ideas that we have is to build like a inclusive, interactive experience that combines all this data. For example, a 3D model that has audio recording, or 3D model that incorporates a map or videos. So those are some of the ideas that we have around this work. As I said, it's an ongoing project. Some of the thoughts. So in case you're sitting there wondering, I want to do a project like this, I want to visualize a part of my history, I want to challenge something, I want to do something with digital media. Some of the questions that you could ask yourself are, what type of visualization are you thinking of? It can be as complex as a 3D model, but it also can be as simple as an illustration. If you have someone illustrate, if you have an artist draw or envision a particular historical period, that is a visualization. What are your sources? And here I like to say, think about legitimacy and bias. One of the questions that I get a lot is when I say that I'm using oral history, people say, but how do you know it's true? And I think if we're working particularly within African knowledge systems, we have to understand that oral history is a legitimate form of passing historical knowledge. And we cannot discount oral history just because it's not written. It's a very, very big disservice. And I think when I look at African history, I feel like we are the biggest resource. Your parents are a resource, your grandparents are a resource. So to ignore this entirely in favor of one paper published in 1940s by a white man who did not even understand the context is a great disservice to the history itself. So what I'm saying is think about your sources in a very broad scope. Use the academic papers, use this 1940 papers, but also look at the people as a resource. Find out, can you challenge this information? Is it true? Is it valid? And I think when you start to use multiple resources, then you can find a way to either legitimize or understand the accuracy or measure it. But do not just rely on one source. And oral history is a big, big source. What skills? Think about what skills do you need and where you can find them. It's very naive, but also it's very nice to think that you might have all the skills. You'll never have all the skills that you need. You can be a techie with no cultural background. You can be a cultural practitioner with no tech background. So when you're thinking of visualization and when you're thinking about working with cultural heritage and digital heritage, ask yourself, what skills do you need? What team can I build? And I even believe that through the hackathon, bringing people together with different skill sets is a perfect way to illustrate how this work can be done. The fourth and perhaps one of the most important points is thinking about your audience. What platforms will you use and how will they access your work? Are you going to put it online? Is it just on social media? Is it in the archive? Is it on a dedicated server that you're hosting? These are some really critical thoughts, because when you think about audiences, you're also thinking about continuity. It's very easy to produce a piece of work and then in 2 years the website is down. So thinking about those kind of things, even at the start of your project, is very, very important. Futures. This is one of my best parts, because I like to theorize on it. And in as much as it's my theory, I still feel that it's very true that digital heritage needs to become a very core part of our understanding of African past. But because digital heritage enables us to exist outside the boundaries that have been set for us, it enables us to challenge, it enables me, a young woman, to go out and document history and share my narrative. So when you look at the potential for digital media, we cannot understate how much it has increased and enabled us to take control of our own stories and our own narratives. By 2050, 2 in every 5 children will be born in Africa, and half of the world's youth will be African in 2100. So what does it mean that if we go online and we can't find our narratives, we can't find perspectives on our history, yet we are such a big part of the world's population? So this work to document, to share, to disseminate needs to be a very, very active process. I think for those of us who have found ourselves at the center, we're producing this knowledge, we are born, we are born into a world where technology is a key thing. We have to ask ourselves, we're at the beginning of this process. What does it mean that 50 years from now, children who've been born with nothing but Google and technology is their main way to access information? We need to be producing content. We need to be producing our own narratives, and we need to have them there. So in 2018, I founded an organization called African Digital Heritage, and I like to say the future of history. It might be a contradictory sentence, but the future of history. When we think about how we engage with history in the future, how do we envision it? And African Digital Heritage is basically founded to try and encourage a more critical, a more holistic, and a more knowledge-based approach to the design and implementation of digital solutions within African cultural heritage. Because we understand that we're dealing with different contexts, we're dealing with different knowledge systems, we're dealing with different infrastructural needs, we're dealing with different skill sets. And I believe that digital heritage isn't a cut-paste solution. It's very hard for me to say, oh, this was done in the British Museum, let me do it in the National Museum of Kenya, because the contexts are different. And we need to be thinking actively how we support our museums, our archives, our audiences to work within heritage in a digital space. So I wrote something down. When I had my first blog, Agora, I went back today to look at the definition that I had written. And I'm going to read it out to you. It says, welcome to this 21st century Agora, a blog committed to the preservation of Kenya's rich history and culture. By covering various aspects of our diverse history, the Agora aims to create an expansive archive of stories, photos, and memories. Currently, most of the historical information found here is based on Kenya and East Africa, but we're looking to expand our content and cover the history of different cities and countries across the entire African continent. I remember this was like 8 years ago. So my vision was very, very big. And when I said we, I meant me, myself, and I. But I stopped writing Agora in 2016. And for a long time, I felt guilty. I felt like I had abandoned it. But what's interesting for me is that when I look at African digital heritage, I have started to look at it as a continuation of Agora, because if I didn't have that blog, I wouldn't have the organization. And I am starting to look at it as one and the same thing. Some of the projects that I've done are the Museum of British Colonialism that I've talked about. The latest project, my latest project is called Open Restitution Africa, which seeks to open up information around the return of African artifacts to center the voices of African practitioners, to create a data platform where information on restitution is available to anyone who needs it. But it's also an Africa-led discussion, and the railway project, which I talked about. A couple of reflections as I wind down. The first one, whenever I'm looking at digital heritage, I feel that it's very important to prioritize the cultural record and the audience before the technology. Why do I say this? Sometimes as techies, I know, you often think that, oh, I know this very cool app that will help, solve this problem and will bring this, and you start with the technology, you start with the app. But when I'm looking at culture, I usually flip the script, because I believe that you start with the cultural record. What do I want to document? What history am I looking at? Where is this history found? Is it found in the archives? In that case, I'll use a phone and a camera. Is it found in oral history? I need to record, So when I say the technology follows, it is informed by the cultural record. And secondly, it's informed by the audience. Who is your audience? Where are they going to access the information? This will determine what kind of technology you use, because you don't want to end up doing a very complex thing, something that could have passed the message with an illustration. So prioritize the cultural record and the audience, the technology will follow. The second point, connection to the historical subject. This is a very, for me, I feel working within spaces in which I understand the context. While I might be very passionate about history, it would be very hard for me today to go to Nigeria and do a project on Yoruba culture, because I do not understand it. So I feel that when you're working within digital heritage, it is very important to have a connection to the historical subject, because what this does is that it gives you a greater understanding and the nuances involved in documenting this culture that you'll understand. And if it's not particularly your culture, you have someone who understands this dynamics, have someone who understands this history, or even who comes from this background, because they will give you an insight that you did not have. Digital work should be participatory and community-oriented. I don't believe, while in movies it's very common to see the image of the lone hacker sitting there just typing away in a dark room alone. It doesn't work like, I don't feel like it works like that. I don't believe that it works like that for digital heritage. I believe that it needs to be a very participatory process. It needs to be community-oriented, asking yourself, who do I need to involve? Who do I need to speak to? Who will help? Who will access this technology? The third point is, I think we really need to legitimize indigenous knowledge systems. On a recent call with the Women's History, I was speaking to the founders of the Women's History Museum of Zambia, and they're building a digital platform for Zambian objects that are held abroad. And what they're doing is also creating a platform that could incorporate oral history, because they realize when using platforms like Wikipedia and platforms that are global, quote unquote, these platforms did not recognize oral history as a source. So anything that was not written, they would cancel it out. What they're doing is building a digital platform that will legitimize oral history as a knowledge source. And I think even us as technical practitioners, as digital practitioners, as Africans, we need to think of how we legitimize indigenous knowledge systems. The fourth one is understanding the impact of your work. While it's easy to think that this is just a tech project and I can move on with my life, I feel like digital heritage actually affects people's lives. When people view their history, when they engage with it in a way that they hadn't seen before, when they see a perspective they hadn't before, when they see something that reminds them of their parent or their great-grandparent, it's engaging, it's restorative, it's holistic, and it contributes to a greater understanding of ourselves. So when you're working within this space, understand that this work has such a huge impact, even beyond the work that you're doing. It has the potential to go into different spheres of influence, different audiences. As I conclude, I'll finish up with this quote by Francis Nyamjo, where he says, he invites us to see the relationship between humans and technologies as a non-linear conversation, a conversation on the entanglements or intricacies between change and continuity, nature and culture, past and present, tradition and modernity, the human and the non-human. And my understanding of this is that we shouldn't see technology as a separate thing from ourselves. We should see it as an extension of ourselves. That technology helps us extend who we already are. We are the basis, and technology helps us extend certain aspects of our lives, whether it's our reach or our travel or our understanding of ourselves. And when we look at this, when we look at technology as an extension of humanity, then we're able to approach digital technology with a very humane perspective, with a very empathetic perspective. And I think when I look at digital heritage, for me, I'm grateful that I have the technical skills, but I'm more grateful that I have access to the culture and to this records and to this field. I believe that technology is an extension of that. And I go back to my introduction, in which I said, I believe that I'm a historian by passion and a computer scientist by profession. So for me, computer science is the extension of myself, which is already built on an understanding of myself as a historian. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, we have come to the end of this lecture / storytelling time. If you would like to get in touch with me, these are my websites. That is my email. And if you have any questions that you would like to ask, I think we have a few more minutes, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you. I'll hand over to you, Kolo.
Thank you so much, Chao. Let me just bring back my video. Thank you so much. So now I think we have 10 minutes left that we'll just field any questions if you guys have them directly for Chao. Okay, there's a couple here. Chao, can you see the questions? There's one in the chat, and then there is one in the Q&A. Okay, not in the Q&A. So I think you can start with the question in the chat.
Okay, do you mind reading it out just in case?
Okay, cool. Oh, she says just a comment here, no question. Thank you for sharing your story with us. I have a degree in ICT and I love history too. This is from Michelle Omar. I have always wanted to showcase African history, culture, and heritage, but I did not know where to start. I just want to say you are amazing and you have inspired me to be fearless. To the team behind Hack Your Culture, thank you so much. You have no idea how you have impacted me and validated my ideas. I know now that I was never on the wrong path. Thank you so much. Michelle, thank you so much for that message.
Thank you, Michelle. I think we build an army of headstrong historians.
Absolutely.
And yeah, go for it.
JCM has said excellent. Let me just see if there are any other questions. Somebody raised their hands. Does anybody have anything to ask Chao directly? Oh, Nana. Okay, I'm going to give you permission to talk, Nana. Nana, you can unmute yourself and ask Chao your question.
Hi. My name is Nana Ofriata-Ayim and I'm based in Ghana. And yeah, thank you so much. This has been incredible, so enriching. My question was, in Ghana, we're working on, I guess, kind of parallel projects. We're working on a digital Pan-African encyclopedia. We're working on a restitution project as well. And my question, I guess, is how do we, as Africans that are working on parallel questions across the continent, how do we connect with each other? I mean, unless I had seen this on Twitter and kind of like connected through that, I'm just wondering, how do we create a network? How do we create lines between each other as Africans on the continent who are working on parallel projects so that we can support each other and reinforce each other?
Oh, wow. Thanks, Nana. I'm a huge fan of your work. I've been following the Mobile Museum. So it's lovely to speak with you in this forum. And to be honest, it's interesting because I feel like in the way that we think of networks, sometimes it's very academic or very high level. You know, we don't think of networking even in a space where you're a practitioner, I'm a practitioner, let's connect. To be honest, I'm not sure. I think platforms like these, Hack Your Culture, and just having more of these conversations online, whether it's on social media, whether it's having webinars or even meeting in person, would go a long way. But I don't know, I think this would be something that perhaps everyone could chime in on, how to better create this networks. I feel that also largely because this work is starting, because we have digital platforms, because we're able to share this work directly without intermediaries, without an institution, or without, you know, a barrier of access, it helps us connect more. So we might think that maybe not much connection is happening, but the very fact that we're having this conversation means that something has changed in one way or another. And I like to believe that, you know, the process, we're not where we were last year or the year before. We are at a different space now. And I think it may be overly optimistic, but I do feel that this in itself and this forum in itself is part of that way of connecting.
Sorry about that, Nana. Is there anybody else who would like to ask Chao a question? Let me see here. Chao, can you see in the Q&A, there's a question for you. It's from JN. I can't see their name, but it says, thank you so much for your presentation. Can you please share the source of your Francis Nyamjo? How do I say that?
I feel like I'm not the expert, but I would say Nyamjo.
Nyamjo. Quote. Yeah. Also, do you have any other reading, listening recommendations about digitizing African histories and technology in Africa in general?
I think that I'll share the quote. I'm trying to think. Can I share it with you, Kolo, and then you can share it on the.
I'll share it on the Discord.
Yeah, but as with reading and listening recommendations about digitizing African heritage, I think there needs to be, probably Nana led us onto this, that we probably have to, it would be good to have a platform where we could just map out what everyone is doing. I know there's work, as Nana said, being done in Ghana, in South Africa, but there's disparate sources. So I wouldn't have a particular reading list right now. But if you send me your email, I could share anything that I've come across in the recent past. Yeah. I need to look at this.
Yes, I think that's definitely a good idea. And I can also share that in the community Discord. I think my question is, are there any podcasts that deal particularly with this topic? Just also following Nana's question.
The topic of digitizing?
Well, I think cultural heritage, digitizing, are there any related podcasts to this topic?
Not that I can think of. I can think of many podcasts on African history that I could send, but not on podcast, not a podcast on digitizing African history. If that makes sense. Yeah.
But it does seem a bit of a narrow topic, so it's probably going to be featured as a podcast topic on an existing. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Let me just post the link to the paper.
Awesome. Guys, so I think we're about to wrap up, but if there's anybody who'd like to say closing comments or ask one final question, I'll give you guys a moment to raise your hand or to type it in the chat. Okay. Chao, that's from you.
I just posted the paper that I referenced. It's a very interesting read. He speaks about how technology is an extension of Africanness. And he draws parallels between juju as a way of life and a way of thinking, and technology as an extension of that. You know, it extends our possibilities and our understanding of ourselves. My favorite paper, one of my favorite papers. So.
Thank you. I'm going to copy this and share it in the community Discord. So thank you everybody who joined today. I think Tao, I'll just give you an opportunity to say your final goodbye, and then I will make sure that people can get a copy of this recording. It'll either be available on YouTube or I'll share it directly via G Drive. Whoever hasn't had the chance to join us live today.
I've just shared my email on the chat if anyone has questions, or I could send a reading list or what I know in terms of what's there. But thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to everyone who's been here and listened to me speak.
Thank you so much, Chao. On behalf of everybody who's working on the Hack Your Culture project, from Goethe, from Credible, from our partners, we really would like to extend our thanks to you, and really appreciate you taking the time to be with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Kolo.
Okay, awesome. To everybody who are the attendees, thank you so much for joining. And I'll look forward to speaking with you guys at the other activities that are going to be upcoming during Hack Your Culture. I wish you all the best and happy hacking.